The world of Lorenzo Moretti was not one of light. It was a kingdom of whispered threats, of shadows that clung to the corners of expensive suits, of decisions made in rooms where the windows were always tinted. His office, a penthouse that overlooked the city like a conqueror's perch, was a temple to this calculated darkness. The air was cold, smelling of old leather and expensive whiskey, a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Here, he was not a man, he was a title. The Wolf. A name earned and worn, with a grim finality. On a night like any other, this silence was broken. The low murmur of two underlings, their faces grim in the lamplight, outlining a problem that required a permanent solution. Lorenzo listened, his back to them, his gaze on the city's twinkling, ignorant grid. He did not move. He did not need to. A single, slow nod was all it took. A signature on a death warrant required no pen. The men understood, the soft shuffle of their retreat the only sound. The order was given. Business, as always, was cold. Then, the phone rang. Not the business line, a cacophony of demands and threats. Not the encrypted device for his captains. This was the third phone. A simple, unassuming thing, its number a ghost known only to 3 people in the world. Its ring was a shrill, alien sound in the tomb-like quiet, a relic from a forgotten life. A jolt, imperceptible to anyone but him, went through his frame. His shoulders, usually a straight line of unyielding power, tightened almost infinitesimally. He crossed the room, his footsteps silent on the polished marble. He picked it up. Yes. The voice on the other end was not one he knew. It was clinical, frayed with the exhaustion of a long shift. Am I speaking to Lorenzo Moretti? Who is this? The question was a low growl, a warning. This is Dr. Evans at Trinity General. I'm calling about a patient. A Jane Doe. She was brought in following a severe hit-and-run. The doctor paused, and in that pause, Lorenzo's world, so meticulously ordered, began to tilt on its axis. She's critical. Fighting for her life. We found no ID, but, in her delirium, she keeps saying a name. She keeps saying Lorenzo. The floor did not open up. The windows did not shatter. But for Lorenzo Moretti, everything stopped. The city outside the glass ceased to exist. The cold business of moments ago was a distant, trivial memory. A name, spoken from a past he had sealed shut, was now a key turning in a lock he thought was rusted closed. Isabella. It could only be her. He was moving before the doctor finished speaking. A sharp gesture, a single word barked into his other phone, garage. Now. And the machine of his life was repurposed. The blacked-out Mercedes tore through the streets, not as a symbol of power, but as a frantic, speeding hearse. His men, hardened men who had seen him execute traitors without a change in heartbeat, saw the look on his face and knew to say nothing. It was the face of a man seeing a ghost. The hospital was a shock of fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic, an assault on his senses. He moved through the corridors, a storm of black wool and palpable menace, nurses and orderlies parting before him like water. He demanded her location, his voice a whip-crack of authority that brooked no argument. When he was directed to the ICU, a cold dread, colder than any he had ever known, wrapped around his heart. And then he saw her. She was a pale smudge against the stark white sheets, dwarfed by the machinery that hissed and beeped a fragile rhythm of life. Tubes snaked from her arms, a ventilator breathed for her. Her face, that face which had once been all sunlight and laughter, was bruised and swollen, a broken doll. But it was her. Isabella. Lorenzo, the wolf, the man who commanded armies of shadows, stopped at the foot of the bed. His hand, which could sign a man's death with a steady flick, rose to grip the cold metal rail. He gripped it so hard the metal groaned in protest. The sight of her was a physical blow, a sucker punch to a soul he thought long since atrophied. The fortress walls he had spent a decade building, brick by bloody brick, crumbled to dust in that single, silent moment. All that was left was the devastating, undeniable truth. He was just a man. And he had never, not for a single second, stopped loving her. The groan of the bed rail was the only sound Lorenzo allowed himself to make, a low, metallic protest swallowed by the sterile hum of the ICU. For a long, suspended moment, he was not a king in his castle of shadows, but a ghost at the feast of his own past, staring at the ruin of the only beautiful thing he had ever touched. The clinical lighting carved harsh lines into Isabella's face, lines that had no business being there, etching a map of suffering where there had once only been the smooth topography of joy. Her hand, resting palm up on the starch-white sheet, seemed impossibly small, the 4 taped to its back a grotesque parasite. He moved then, a slow, deliberate unfolding of his large frame, the predator's grace momentarily absent, replaced by a stiffness that spoke of an ancient, reawakened pain. He did not sit so much as collapse into the chair beside her bed, the leather of his coat sighing as it settled. His eyes, usually chips of obsidian taking the measure of a man's soul before condemning it, were now wide, vulnerable, tracing every contour of her face, every bruise, every scrape. He saw the girl who had laughed with her head thrown back in a sun-drenched piazza, now trapped behind the pale mask of the woman fighting for breath. A memory, unbidden and viciously sharp, pierced through him. Not of the end, with its bitter words and manufactured cruelty, but of the middle. A tiny kitchen, steam fogging the windows, the radio playing some tinny, forgotten love song. She was dancing, a slow, silly sway of her hips as she stirred a pot of pasta sauce, a smudge of tomato on her cheek. He had come up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and buried his face in the scent of her hair, sunshine and rosemary. She had leaned back into him, her laugh a vibration against his chest. "You're home early," she had murmured, and the word home in her mouth had felt like a truth he had never known he was searching for. He had been just Lorenzo then. Not Moretti. Not the wolf. Just a man, desperately in love. The ache of that memory was a physical wound in his gut. His gaze fell to her lips, now chapped and parted for the breathing tube. Those lips had whispered secrets against his skin, had spoken of a future he knew, even then, he could never grant her. The cruelty of his own design, the brilliant, terrible strategy to make her hate him, to make her so afraid of the man he appeared to be that she would never dare look back, felt like the most profound failure of his life. He had built his empire on the foundation of her absence, each act of violence, each consolidation of power, another layer of insulation around the hollow space where she had been. He had thought the hollow space was numb. He now realized it had only been dormant, a live wire waiting for this moment to electrocute him. A soft, delirious murmur escaped her. A jumble of syllables, but his name was there, tangled in the midst of it. Lorenzo. It was a breath, a plea, a curse from the depths of her subconscious. It broke him. His own breath hitched, a ragged, unprofessional sound. Slowly, as if reaching for a holy relic, his hand moved. He hesitated, his fingers hovering just inches above her own. This hand had held guns, had dealt blood money, had inflicted pain as a matter of course. To place its stain upon her skin felt like a sacrilege. But the need to connect, to feel the warmth of her life, was a compulsion he could not fight. His fingers, trembling with a weakness he had not felt since he was a boy, finally brushed against hers. The contact was a jolt, a current of pure, undiluted life. Her skin was warm. He leaned forward, his voice, when it came, was a hoarse, broken thing, stripped of all its power and authority, meant for her ears alone. "Bella," he whispered, the old endearment tasting like ash and hope on his tongue. "I'm here." The words were inadequate, a pebble thrown into the chasm of their years apart. "You have to fight. Do you hear me?" His grip on her fingers tightened, a gentle pressure. "You were always the strongest person I knew. Stronger than me. So much stronger." He bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the bed rail, his next words a confession torn from the deepest, darkest part of him. "I never stopped. I never. God, Isabella, I am so sorry." Outside the room, visible through the slatted window in the door, stood Marco. He had followed, a silent, watchful shadow, and now he observed his Don, his friend, crumpled at the bedside of a ghost. He saw the bow of Lorenzo's head, the raw anguish in the set of his shoulders. Marco's own face, usually a mask of pragmatic calm, softened with a profound, weary sorrow. He had been there. He had seen the before, and he had helped orchestrate the terrible, necessary after. He knew the truth of the sacrifice, and seeing the price of it now, a decade later, made his own heart feel heavy as stone. He turned his back to the door, not to give privacy, but to stand guard, to protect this moment of devastating vulnerability from the cruel and watching world that Lorenzo Moretti had built. Inside the room, the only sounds were the mechanical sigh of the ventilator and the soft, ragged whispers of a man praying to a god he had long since forsaken, begging for a miracle he knew he did not deserve. The confession, once begun, became a torrent Lorenzo could not stem. The sterile, silent room became a confessional, the only priest a woman trapped between life and death. His voice, a low, continuous murmur, was the antithesis of every order he had ever barked, every threat he had ever uttered. It was the raw, unvarnished sound of a soul tearing itself open. "I thought it was the only way," he whispered, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles on the back of her hand, a gesture of tenderness that felt both alien and instinctive. "My father, he showed me a file. Photographs of you leaving the gallery, of you buying groceries. He said love was a target painted on your back, that every rival, every enemy, would see you as the key to my destruction. He said the only way to keep you safe was to make you despise the very idea of me." He let out a shaky breath, the memory of that confrontation a cold knot in his stomach. "So I became the monster he needed me to be. For you." He spoke of that final night, a performance that had won him no awards, only a lifetime of internal scars. He described the cruel, calculated words he had practiced in the mirror, the way he had let the ice in his veins show, freezing the warmth in her eyes. He told her about the other woman, a paid actress from a rival family, whom he had paraded before her, a final, brutal act of desecration of their love. "The look in your eyes," he choked out, "the memory of Freshblade. It wasn't just hurt. It was extinction. As if the light in you had been snuffed out. And I had to stand there and let you think it was me who put it out." For hours, he unspooled the decade that followed. He spoke of the hollow victories, the empty territories won, the vast fortune accumulated, a kingdom of dust and echoes. He described the penthouse that was never a home, just a fortified cage. He confessed to the nights spent staring at a single, hidden photograph of them, taken on a pier, the wind in her hair, a genuine, unforced smile on his own face, a ghost of the man he had murdered so she could live. "I built an empire, Bella," he murmured, his voice thick with a bitter irony. "I became the most powerful moon in this city. And I have never felt so powerless as I do in this moment, looking at you." His men, stationed outside the door, exchanged uneasy glances. The low, relentless murmur from inside the room was a sound they had never heard. It was the sound of their fortress, their unshakable mountain, crumbling from the inside out. Marco stood as a bulwark against their silent questions, his own posture rigid, his face a complex map of loyalty and dread. He knew the secrets being spilled in that room were more volatile than any stockpile of weapons. A vulnerable dawn was a dead dawn. The world outside these hospital walls was a jungle, and the predators had already begun to scent weakness on the wind. As dawn began to bleed a pale, sickly gray at the edges of the window blinds, Lorenzo's monologue finally stilled. The well of words had run dry, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. Exhaustion weighed on him like a lead cloak. His head rested against the side of her mattress, his hand still enveloping hers, a desperate anchor. In the quiet, the steady, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was a lullaby of grim persistence. It was then that he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible pressure against his palm. His head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes wide, fixed on her hand. He held his breath, every fiber of his being focused on that single point of contact. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. He wondered if he had imagined it, a phantom sensation born of sleep deprivation and desperate hope. Then it came again. A slow, deliberate curl of her fingers, a weak but undeniable answering squeeze. The air left Lorenzo's lungs in a rush. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a whisper of movement, a flicker of life from the depths of her coma. But to him, it was a seismic event. It was a stone cast back across the chasm. It was the first thread, fragile as a spider's silk, thrown back across the void of their ruined past. He did not speak. He could not. He simply bowed his head over their joined hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent, overwhelming storm of emotion. The war for her life was not over, but the first, crucial battle had just been won. And in the quiet of that sterile room, a different war, one for a future he had never dared to dream of, had just begun. The squeeze of her fingers was a tremor that reverberated through the very foundations of his being. In that single, fragile movement, the stagnant air in the room seemed to shift, charged with a new, electric potential. Lorenzo remained frozen, his head bowed over their joined hands, afraid that any movement, any breath, might shatter the delicate reality of the moment. It was not consciousness, not yet. It was something deeper, more primal, a signal from the core of her will, a confirmation that the woman he remembered, the fighter whose spirit had once matched his own in intensity if not in darkness, was still there, battling her way back to the surface. He did not dare speak her name again, fearing the sound of his voice might startle her back into the abyss. Instead, he simply held on, his grip firm yet gentle, a tether in the swirling chaos of her subconscious. He became a sentinel to her slow, arduous journey back, marking the subtle signs of her struggle. The faint flutter of her eyelids, like moth wings against glass. The slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. The soft, ragged breath she drew on her own, a whisper of sound that harmonized with, then briefly challenged, the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. Each tiny victory was a jewel he collected in the darkness, a counterweight to a decade of loss. Marco, ever watchful, saw the change in his Don's posture from the doorway. The absolute despair had been replaced by a wired, hypervigilant focus. Lorenzo's gaze was locked on Isabella, cataloging every minute shift in her expression, every hitch in her breathing. It was the look of a general who had just seen a flicker of hope on a besieged battlefield. Marco felt a cold knot of apprehension tighten in his own stomach. Hope was a dangerous thing in their world. It was a distraction, an opening. He had already fielded 3 terse calls from captains confused by the Don's unexplained absence, his silence on pressing matters of territory and finance. The machine was beginning to stutter without its central, driving force. As if summoned by this very vulnerability, the world outside the hospital's sterile bubble chose that moment to intrude. Lorenzo's personal phone, the one connected to his empire, vibrated with an insistent, angry hum. He ignored it, his world narrowed to the woman in the bed. It stopped, then began again, a persistent, angry insect. With a snarl of pure fury that was the first sound he'd made in hours, Lorenzo finally moved. He released Isabella's hand with aching slowness, stood, and strode to the far corner of the room, his movements once again those of the predator, fluid and deadly. He answered the phone. He did not speak. The voice on the other end was smooth, oily, laced with a mock concern that did nothing to hide the taunt beneath. Lorenzo. We've been missing your presence. The city feels unbalanced without your firm hand guiding it. It was Alessio. Lorenzo's free hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. What do you want? The words were chips of ice. Alessio's chuckle was a dry, unpleasant sound. I merely called to express my concern. I hear you've taken a sudden, deep interest in the medical profession. Spending so much time in one place, it's unlike you. It makes a man wonder what, or who, could be so captivating to draw the great wolf into a gilded cage. The pause was deliberate, heavy with unspoken threat. A moon in your position should be careful. A cage, even a gilded one, is still a trap. And there are so many accidents that can happen in a hospital. The line went dead. Lorenzo stood motionless, the phone still pressed to his ear. The threat was clear, a blade aimed directly at Isabella's heart. Alessio knew. He knew she was here, he knew she was his weakness, and he was moving to exploit it. The cold, calculating part of Lorenzo's mind, the part that had kept him alive and in power for a decade, roared back to life. The time for confession, for quiet vigil, was over. The war had found him, even here. He turned from the corner, his eyes finding Isabella once more. But the look on his face was transformed. The raw vulnerability was gone, burned away by a cold, focused fury. The love was still there, a constant, burning star at his core, but it was now encased in an armor of pure, unyielding will. He walked back to the bedside, his presence now radiating a different kind of energy, not a supplicant, but a protector. A king ready to defend his queen. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a low, resonant whisper, a vow made not to an unconscious woman, but to the universe itself. They will not touch you, he promised, the words absolute, final. I let you go once to keep you safe. I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone harm you again. He pressed a kiss, fierce and possessive, to her forehead. Then, he turned and walked out of the room, his posture once more that of the dawn, the wolf. The ghost was gone. The general had returned. The battle for the past was over. The war for their future had just begun. The door to the hospital room clicked shut behind Lorenzo Moretti, and with that soft, final sound, the man who had confessed his sins to a ghost vanished. In his place, striding down the sterile corridor with a predator's grace that made orderlies flinch and nurses look away, was the Don. The wolf. His eyes, once raw with a decade of regret, were now twin pools of liquid obsidian, reflecting no light, offering no quarter. The air around him crackled with a renewed and terrible purpose. Marco fell into step beside him, a silent shadow, recognizing the transformation instantly. The time for mourning was over. The season of war had begun. Lorenzo did not speak until they were ensconced in the blacked-out Mercedes, the city a blur of muted light outside the tinted windows. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, a stark contrast to the broken whispers of the night before. Alessio knows she's here. He called. He threatened her. Marco absorbed this, his face grim. He's testing you. Probing the weakness. It is not a weakness, Lorenzo corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. It is a line he has crossed. He sees a vulnerability. I will show him a fault line. He began to issue commands, a stream of cold, precise instructions that would set his entire organization into motion. Security at the hospital was to be tripled, his most trusted, discreet men placed inside, not just at the door. Isabella's records were to be wiped, her existence within those walls becoming a state secret. Every holding, every front company connected to Alessio was to be audited, pressured, and squeezed. I want him looking at the flames in his own house, Lorenzo said, his gaze fixed on the passing city. I want him to forget, for just a moment, about the match he thinks he holds. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of controlled, brutal violence. The city's underworld, a delicate ecosystem of fear and respect, felt the shift. Lorenzo's retribution was not a blind rage, it was a surgical strike. A shipping warehouse owned by Alessio's Shell Corporation was mysteriously flooded. A key lieutenant was found, unharmed but terrified, in the trunk of his own car, a single, black rose pinned to his lapel, the wolf's calling card. It was a message, clear and brutal: I am watching. I am everywhere. And you have my full attention. Lorenzo moved between his penthouse war room and the hospital, a pendulum of violence and vigil. He would spend hours orchestrating the dismantling of Alessio's operations, his voice cold and steady, then he would return to the chair beside Isabella's bed. But he was different there now. The confessor was gone. In his place was a sentinel, a king guarding his most precious treasure. He would hold her hand and speak to her, but his words were no longer of the past. They were promises of the future. The man who did this to you will kneel, he would tell her, his voice low and certain. And when you open your eyes, this war will be over. I will make the world safe for you. Again. It was on the 5th day, as a pale dawn broke over the city skyline, that the miracle he had been silently, fiercely demanding, finally occurred. He was in the chair, his head leaning back against the wall, his eyes closed not in sleep but in a state of hyper-alert rest, when he heard a soft, ragged sound that was not the machine. His eyes snapped open. Isabella's eyelids were fluttering, a slow struggle against a great weight. A soft groan escaped her lips. Her hand twitched in his. Lorenzo leaned forward, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Bella, he whispered, the name a prayer. Her eyes opened. They were clouded with confusion, heavy with medication and trauma, but they were open. They focused, blurred, and focused again, slowly finding his face in the hazy light. There was no recognition at first, only the disorientation of waking in an unknown place. Then, her gaze cleared, sharpened, and settled on him. A lifetime of memory, the sun-drenched piazza, the tiny kitchen, the brutal, shattering goodbye, passed through her hazy consciousness in a single, silent moment. Her brow furrowed. Her lips, dry and cracked, parted. Her voice was a ghost of a sound, a rough scrape of air, but the word was unmistakable. Lorenzo. It was not the delirious murmur of the coma. It was a conscious acknowledgement. A naming. It held confusion, and pain, and 1,000 unasked questions, but it was her voice, truly her voice, speaking his name back into the world of the living. He did not crush her to him. He did not weep. He simply brought her hand to his lips and held it there, his eyes closed, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her touch, her voice, her gaze. The fortress around his heart, which had been rebuilt not of stone but of tempered steel in the past few days, did not crumble. It simply found, at long last, its rightful occupant. The war with Alessio was not over. The past was not forgiven. The future was a tangled, uncertain road. But in that quiet hospital room, as the sun finally crested the buildings and poured liquid gold through the blinds, Lorenzo Moretti and Isabella Rossi had found their way back to the same moment in time. The story of the Mafia boss and the woman who fought for her life was far from over. Their world was still one of shadows and threats, but a new chapter was beginning, one written not in blood and regret, but in the fragile, unbreakable ink of a second chance. If you were captivated by the story of Lorenzo and Isabella, if you felt the crackle of their tension and the depth of their fractured love, then you cannot miss what comes next. Subscribe now, because their journey of danger, redemption, and fierce love is only just beginning.